to the breakouts, I would like to welcome Stefan Bergheim. And yeah, I will say a few words to introduce him, but before I do so, I want to also introduce the topic that he is going to talk about. My question to him was, why is it relevant for the present to think about the future? And we heard before from Anja that, yeah, in the systems that we work in are getting ever more complex. So I think this is a relevant question to answer. How can we deal with that complexity, and how can futures literacy help us in that regard? And Stefan, before I give you the word and ask you my first questions, I want to say a few words about you. You started researching about the future already in 1996, and then you were a trend researcher for Deutsche Bank from 2001 until 2008, if I'm not mistaken. And since then, you have been the director of the Zentrum für gesellschaftlichen Fortschritt, which translates to Center for Societal Progress. You worked with UNESCO and helped them design various fora and summits on future literacy. And most recently, you have helped to develop a format called Futures Lab, or Futures Laboratories, or Futures Literacy Laboratories, as you want to call them. And he's an advocate, or you are an advocate for open, interdisciplinary and co-creative processes. And I suppose now it's all clear to the audience why I invited you to speak today. So very warm welcome.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Perfect. Yeah. Stefan, so from the introduction, we heard that in your past life, you worked for banks, and I suppose you did growth forecasts and trend research. So what is different between your work back then and the work on futures literacy that you are doing today?
Yeah, and you didn't mention all the banks, because there are some worse names even on my CV. There's also JP Morgan and Merrill Lynch in there, the thundering herd, the dark side of banking, maybe long time ago. But back then, our task, my task, or the task of all the economists, and I'm trained as an economist, the task of all the economists in those banks was basically to provide certainty, to reduce uncertainty, and to help investors and also the own company to plan and predict, and maybe even to control the future. That was the idea. You have so and so much funds, and you need to do something with it. And they turned to us, Stefan, tell us, what is the future going to be? Is the central bank going to raise interest rates or to reduce interest rates? So that was the task there, and we were the experts. We would know, or at least we claimed, and there was a big competition across the different banks. Who's the better experts? Who has the more precise forecast? That actually, it does exist. I think it still exists. So that's the old world. And there were so many crises and disasters. The Asian crisis was the first one that I experienced in banking in 1997, and then there's one crisis after the other. So obviously that didn't work for me, at least. That was not feasible. So over the years, I learned more and more about complexity theory, obviously, and now. What I'm trying to do now is support people to embrace uncertainty, not to do away with uncertainty, but to live with it, to enjoy it, to say, well, how great is it that we have this uncertainty, because that's a breeding ground for novelty. Something new can emerge. If everything would be plannable, then there would be no room for emergence. And also not just experts. Who am I to know, to tell the future? That's not possible. But what we can do in the present is to involve a lot of people in these collective intelligence knowledge creation processes to think about the present, actually, by using the future. That's what we do. So by now, I'm no longer really an expert. I'm a designer and facilitator of futures processes.
Thank you very much. And yeah, we also gathered from the little introduction that you've worked with people from very diverse backgrounds, also in your present work, actually, with investors, of course, with the corporate sector, with the social sector, with politicians. And in an ideal scenario, you also bring them all together in your labs. So tell us, why is it relevant for all of us to think about the future, and what can we learn by doing that? Which competences can we actually develop, if any? And could it actually be that we are not doing this often enough?
Yeah, well, we're actually doing it all the time. All of us, we're all thinking about the future basically every day. Every morning when we get out of bed, we're thinking about the future. What's the day going to hold? And when we join a meeting like this, we think about, so what's it going to bring? What do I want to contribute? What is a good outcome? What do I want to enjoy in that meeting? When I cross the street, I need to think about the future. I need to make well, in this case, also a prediction about the speed of the cyclist approaching me. It's everywhere. What we're trying to do in this futures literacy network, so futures literacy is the competence to use the future for different reasons with different methods. What we're trying to do there is invite people into using the future slightly more consciously and in more diverse ways. So understanding, yes, I do use the future. Using the weather forecast is also a very, very simple example. And also use it in the complex systems all the time. And there's actually a big theory behind this, all of this, because all of us, we have images of futures in our minds. We think about the future, as I mentioned, and we create images. And actually all living beings have a model of themselves and of their environment, of how they act. That's theory of anticipation by the biologist Robert Rosen. So what we do is try to make visible those models and actually the assumptions behind the models. Most of you have built models maybe in your university careers, and models usually consist of assumptions. And if you change the assumptions, then different models and different images of the future result. And those images of the future that we all hold, they determine what we do in the present. That's why it's so interesting, in my perspective, to experiment with different futures, because it enriches our perspectives about the present.
I really liked thank you very much. I really liked when I read your paper, this image of, even nature. In nature, it happens all the time as well. So trees like let go of their leaves in anticipation for the winter. And we all act in anticipation of something that we assume will happen in the future. And it's really struck me when I thought, oh, if I change my assumptions about the future, how will that impact my my activities that I do on a daily basis, or do tomorrow, or whenever, do in the next minute? So, so thank you very much. I would like actually to open the floor to all of you to see, are there any questions that you have for Stefan before I ask my next question? You can also unmute yourself if you want to ask it, or write it in the chat, however you feel most comfortable. I'll let you think. Oh, yeah. Work around assumptions links nicely to the inner work dimensions we discussed earlier. Anja writes, yes. Do you want to say a few words about that, Stefan? You were nodding as well when Kurt was talking about the inner work.
Well, I especially like the outer action part. I like that one very much when he mentioned that part. But it's a connection between the two. It's the inner work, especially if done collectively. I mean, first, for me to be conscious of my own assumptions, my own models about the future, that's important. But even more interesting is for me being aware of your assumptions, your models, and discussing them with you and saying, aha, interesting. So you have this this assumption, this image of the future. Ah, interesting. So where might that come from? And how does it differ from mine? So appreciating all the models that are out there, they're just there. Yeah. That's a great combination, doing the inner and the collective intelligence.
Yeah, not to judge, but actually to use it as an important information. I see that. Thank you for that. And I see Georgia has raised her hand. So why don't you ask a question?
Thank you so much. I haven't read any of the papers on future thinking or futures literacy, but what popped into my mind when you introduced this segment and how we have to live and embrace uncertainty is that if everything was certain and clear and we could plan accordingly, we wouldn't need hope or faith, right? We only need them in to deal with the uncertain future. And I was just wondering, when you're saying that, this type of future literacy help us to inform our perspectives of the present. How do you work with hope, faith, and what does it mean for how hopeful or optimistic we can be in creating those more positive futures? Because and how is that a leverage for acting?
Thank you. Super question. I mean, hope certainly is a topic that comes up a lot. Also trust and being relaxed about all of this, and not being too nervous about trying to control. And there's one Bayo Akumulafe always says, the times are urgent. Let's slow down. That's totally consistent with this complexity. Well, the basic mechanism, to condense it, how we instill hope in the participants is for them to see the richness of the future and the present, or discover together that there are just so many options, so many possibilities, and not get nervous about it, there being too many, and not get overwhelmed. What do I do? And then see what you want, where your energy is, what you want to pick, what do you want to do next, and understand that maybe next week you discover, oh no, that was not the best idea, and you do something different based on this richness. That happens. So you need to make, it's all complexity theory again, with attractors, experiments, pattern recognition, all these topics. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Georgia, for taking the courage and for the great question. There's another question in the chat by Ken. In your experience, do people or entities make their future images a reality with their own actions, by imagining and assuming that it will become real one day and working towards it?
Well, certainly what people are doing is work towards something, oftentimes towards their own image of I mean, that's what we do all the time. This is why it's so important to reveal those images, because they inform our action. They are relevant to what we do. And if we change images, as I mentioned, then maybe some different action will happen. But again, don't be disappointed if what your current image of a successful future is turns out to be no longer your image of a successful future 2 years down the road, maybe. I mean, I'm giving you my example, and what Aline asked, as a banker, 20 years ago, I had a totally different image of what a successful career would look like than I have today. Happens, and I'm okay with that. And that happens also with, and it of course requires some flexibility. And I know with investors, it's not trivial if you need to invest something or commit for a project or something for 10, 20 years. It's a big decision, of course, and we need to be aware of that.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So yeah, we've been talking about lab process all the time. So you have a lab that we kind of, a lab methodology that we want to integrate actually into the TFL. So can you tell us a bit about the Futures Literacy Lab in a nutshell? How does it work, and what can I take away as a participant?
Yeah, very briefly, and it's actually not a method that I developed. It's a joint global effort that was led by UNESCO the last 10 years, especially by Riel Miller, and I put the key book source into the chat. That's actually an open access resource, not trivial to read, but there you see where it all comes from. And it's basically a 4-phase process where we go first into revealing those assumptions that I talked about, and second, about reframing our images. So work with a different set of assumptions, experiment in a lab context, obviously, experiment with a different set of assumptions. And that's critical as a catalyst for our creativity, or for the creativity of the participants in those laboratories. And then they discover something new. And that's what they do in the third phase, which is called the rethinking phase, where we look at, in the first phase, we're talking about probable and preferred futures, and then we have this alternative experimental future, and we look at all of those, or participants look at all those three futures, and they discover something new usually, because it's not something that they usually do is think along those lines, and they rethink the topic. We actually just last week did a lab, a 2-day lab on the future of money with the bank, and they do discover new ideas, and that leads then into the fourth phase, where they create actions for the present, actually. So that's new questions. It's phase 3, rethinking new questions for the present of the topic, and then the fourth phase is this action phase, and it's all, yeah. And actually, the book is called Transforming the Future. That's, you have the transformation there as well. And or one slogan we often use is, we try to change the conditions of change. People see something after those labs that they didn't do without the labs, and they sense something that they didn't sense or wouldn't sense without the lab, and they make sense out of what they see in a different way than they would without. So yeah, I'll leave it there. I'm just totally excited, and especially the second phase, this reframing phase, working with an alternative future that doesn't need to be likely or probable, it's just different. That's the crucial element, just playing around with that and then throwing it away after that phase. It's a throwaway experiment future to discover something new, catalyst.
So who's up for trying it out? At least, yeah, there's a few hesitating hands. Well, that's what we are set out to do in a very light teaser version, if you want. Thank you very much, Stefan. If you have any questions for Stefan, still try to use the chat. I'm sure he's glad to answer them.